For folks who don't know me, I'm the clinical specialist for the servo vent, and Janice had just asked me to come in and talk to you guys a little bit about bi-event or APRV. We've done an in-service before in the past, and we just thought, hey, it would be a good opportunity to film the in-service. So just for folks who may miss the in-service, we can call people, that sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Screen here. And so, just kind of thinking about bi-event, a lot of times, besides NAVITS, is probably one of the things that I do the most as far as in-services go, with anything that we do as far as offerings of the ventilator. Along with NAVA, bi-event is just something that we in-service pretty routinely. And if you think about it, when we're in a hospital, if you guys go up to your ICU or your PICU today, your NICU or PICU, you guys hear things like tidal volume, respiratory rate, all those kind of things. But, with bi-event, it's a little different because we don't hear any of that terminology. And so that kind of makes the whole bi-event terminology a little bit foreign to us. But the PICU, NICU folks, children's hospital people actually have a great advantage when we start talking about bi-event. We'll definitely get into that just because of some of their previous workings with other modes of ventilation. So, if I had to describe bi-event, probably, if somebody said, hey, we're going to give you one sentence to describe what bi-event is, I would essentially say it's a patient spontaneously breathing between two levels of CPAP. If I want to expound on that, I would say that the patient's going to spend a large amount of time at the upper level of CPAP, and they're going to spend a very short period of time at the lower level of CPAP. And like I said, the patient can actually spontaneously breathe at any point during the upper level of CPAP or the lower level of CPAP. So, kind of starting to talk about bi-event, if I hit the bi-event key here on the servo vent, I actually bring up the parameters for the ventilator. And so I see a P high, and then I see a peak value, and it's kind of important to know this. You'll hear me call the peak P low because that's what I routinely call peak. You probably won't hear me refer to peak very often as peak in this. I'll actually refer to this as P low. And for folks who may do some research or look at some literature based on APRV, you'll find that most people, when they talk about these pressures, they talk about P high and P low, not really P high and peak. So just remember, for this particular discussion here, PEEP is going to be equal to P low. So the P high is my upper CPAP level. And the PEEP or P low, that's going to be my lower CPAP level. And the amount of time that I spend at my upper CPAP level is going to be my time at higher, T high. And the amount of time that I spend at that lower CPAP level or that PEEP level is going to be my T peak or T low. Now, what kind of patients do we put this on? The first thing that jumps into my mind is a patient that I'm going to have difficulty oxygenating. Now, Gerald, if you guys have a patient difficult to oxygenate, in the NICU, and you've tried everything that you can in conventional ventilation, do you guys do anything else for that patient?
We would probably give them INO.
Okay. How about, would you ever go to the oscillator?
Or place them on the oscillator.
Yeah. And so when you guys put a patient on the oscillator, and you may not be thinking about this in conventional ventilation, but what value do you look at significantly when you put a patient on the oscillator? What measured value for the patient do you look at significantly? You look at the patient's MAP, right?
You look at the MAP.
Because MAP equals what blood gas value? PaO2. The higher the MAP, the higher the patient's PaO2 is going to be. I mean, and you can almost say that, no matter what. But, obviously there's going to be a point probably where you can get to alveolar overdistension. But for the most part, the higher the patient's mean airway pressure is, the higher the patient's PaO2 is going to be. So you guys get very focused in on the MAP when you put a patient on the oscillator. We're going to get very focused in on the MAP when we put a patient on bi-event. We're going to boost a patient's MAP very similarly to how we do with the oscillator. We're going to boost a patient's MAP significantly to help improve that patient's PaO2. So the kind of patient that I really think of as the first patient that I'm going to use for bi-event is going to be that patient that has refractory hypoxemia. the difficult to oxygenate patients. You know, you guys have a PICU, the trauma patient in the PICU, hit by a car, chest wall injury, those kind of patients, difficult to oxygenate. Those are some of the first frontline patients that I think that I'm going to use Bivent on. Since you guys already use the oscillator routinely, the other patients that I kind of think of is, before I go to the oscillator, I might actually try Bivent as a bandage to actually stop me having to go to the oscillator. So candidates that I'm thinking about the oscillator, I may want to attempt on Bivent first, because it's going to be similar mechanism of action as far as boosting the patient's mean airway pressure. And if I can avoid rolling one machine out and rolling another machine in, well, that's actually a good thing. You're never going to be able to constantly avoid the oscillator. It's just, you know, there's going to be some patients that you're going to need the oscillator for. But for the most part, the APRV will definitely help you maybe at least minimize some of the patients that you have on the oscillator. Okay, so looking at these values and looking at these settings, and Janice and the folks in education are working to get you guys a protocol, just kind of a cheat sheet, and it'll have a lot of these things that we talk about here on this, but they're going to have some starting values and some kind of things that we can make changes to the blood gases, that sort of thing. But we're going to go over them real quick here. So I have these four values that I'm really going to focus in on: the P high, the P lower peak, the T high, and the T low or TP. So if I'm going to set my P high up, one of the things that I definitely understand working in a children's hospital is I understand the need for increasing that mean airway pressure. And a good rule of thumb is for you guys, set your P high about 2 to 3 centimeters higher than what your desired mean airway pressure is going to be. So, you know, I think probably, and I don't know for certain, but a lot of children's hospitals will say, well, in conventional ventilation, we have a MAP of 13, and they may want to go up 2 to 3 centimeters higher whenever they go to the oscillator. You can still use that rule of thumb. So if you said, well, we're at 13, we're going to go up to 15. Well, if you wanted a MAP of 15 here, you would probably set your P high around 18. That would be the way to get that MAP, you know, at 2 to 3 centimeters, you know, below whatever you set your P high. So a good rule of thumb for setting the P high, just set it at 2 to 3 centimeters higher than where you desire your mean airway pressure to be. Okay? So I'm going to say I want my mean airway pressure to be 23. So I'm going to set my P high at 25 right now. Now, the P per P low, I'm going to set that at 0. Now, at this point in the proceedings, you may be kind of scratching your head saying, no, wait a minute. Now, we're setting a peak value of 0 on patients that we're talking about that are refractory hypoxemic ARDS style patients. I'm a little concerned with setting my PEEP at 0. I promise by the end of this, you'll see that we'll actually have plenty of PEEP on board, even though we won't actually set PEEP. But I'm going to set this PEEP at 0, and I'm never ever going to change it, and we'll definitely explain that why going forward. Now, the T high and the TP. If we think about this, the airway pressure release ventilation, as you guys know it, this is the term that we hear with Bivent. You know, it was invented as airway pressure release ventilation. The releases come as a combination of the T high and T low. So if I kind of think about this for just a second, right now the T high and the T low represents one cycle of ventilation. So that would be my total cycle time for a mechanical breath. So right now, if I had this set at 0.5, my T peak per T low, and I set this at 5.5 for my T high, that would mean that I had a total cycle time of 6 seconds. So with 60 seconds being in a minute, in a 6-second total cycle time, I would know that I'm going to have 10 releases in the course of a minute. Now, I don't have to be a mathematician to figure that one out, but there's going to be some other settings here where you might not be so easy to do, but you have up in the upper right-hand box here, you have that release rate calculated for you based on whatever you set your T high and T low. Now, where do we set those values? You know, you guys see a huge range of patients, from the neonatal patient all the way up to 21 years old. I mean, that's going to be a great variety of patients. Probably one of the easiest things to think about is the smaller your patient is, probably the smaller these T's are going to end up being. And the reason that is because, simply put, the smaller my T high is, especially my T high, but definitely my T high, smaller my T high is, the more releases my ventilator is going to have in the course of a minute. So In a NICU patient, he's probably going to need more mechanical releases than an 18-year-old patient, just because of the respiratory rate, that sort of thing, if that makes sense. So I'm probably going to end up with a much lower T high on my much smaller patients, probably going to end up with bigger T highs on the larger patient. Kind of a good rule of thumb, you know, for the NICU patients, that T high is going to be, you'll see the literature, different books say different things, but you'll see anywhere from 2.5 to 4 seconds, you know, really on the NICU patient. Probably going to be, you know, 2.5 to 3.5 seconds, kind of typical. And, you know, for your pediatric patient, because you have such a large variety of patients there, you'll see anywhere from 3.5 all the way up to 6 seconds. So you'll definitely see a large amount of variety with that, depending on the size of the patient. Just think about this too, guys. We're going to talk about mean airway pressure. Mean airway pressure is really going to be a product of my P high and how long I hold that in. So those two values are going to affect my mean airway pressure. We'll kind of get to that when we talk about making some adjustments. I'm going to stick to 5.5 right now because I'm kind of working with a large pediatric patient. We'll just kind of do that for ease of use with the math. And now my T low or T peak, that's really the amount of time that we're going to allow our patient to fully exhale his chest cavity here whenever he actually releases. So this is the release time, if you will, in APRV. Once again, we're going to kind of start that. The smaller the patient, probably going to start a smaller number because, you know, an infant's not going to require nearly as much time to empty out his chest cavity as lungs as a 20-year-old that, you know, has, you know, 2,000 cc capability, you know. So you're going to end up with a higher value on the pediatric patient, lower value in the NICU. NICUs use values lots of times in the 0.3 to 0.4 range. PICUs you'll see, you know, starting about 0.4 to 0.5 all the way up to 0.8, you know, for that. And we'll kind of talk about what some of these adjustments mean whenever we take a look at this. So if I start this up with those settings, now the first thing that I'm going to notice here is the ventilator constantly allows the patient to take a spontaneous breath. So now I know for a lot of the PICU people that kind of is one of those things that might be mind-numbing just because you have so many patients that you might sedate in the PICU, and you certainly can still sedate the patient. You know, we're not talking about having the patient up doing a crossword puzzle. We're simply talking about, you know, if they're able to spontaneously breathe and if you're able to allow them to spontaneously breathe, you'll end up with just a lot better capability of managing your CO2 and you won't have to compromise so much about that. We're going to talk about some of the compromises that you have to make, but the more your patient spontaneously breathes, the less you'll actually have to make on the compromised side of the ventilator. So if I look at this here, my patient can spontaneously breathe at any point. So, you know, obviously my pink T's are my patient breathing, and I see these teeny tiny tidal volumes here when the patient's taking spontaneous effort, and then it's followed by a much larger release volume as the ventilator drops down from P high down to P low. So this would be a very normal look at bivent on a patient. So we set the patient up, we talked about the initial parameters. What do we do next? You know, lots of times there's going to be adjustments that need to be made, and we're going to just go through the 4 values and kind of talk about what changes that those values do for your blood gas, you know, and some of the mechanical changes that it'll make with your patient's settings here. If I go up on the P high, and the P high is a very special button. If I go up on the P high, what will that do to my patient's mean airway pressure? It'll increase it, right? Because, you know, we're going to hold the same amount of time, but we're going to hold more pressure in over time. So obviously, if I increase my P high, that's going to definitely increase the mean airway pressure. Now, let's think about this. Right now, my mechanical exhale volume is 400, and that's going from 25 down to 0. If I go from 30 down to 0, what's that going to do to that release volume? Probably going to increase it, right? Because I'm dropping further down. So if I accept that, and I then take a look at this exhale volume here, once that larger breath gets in, I'm going to see that both my mean airway pressure is going to go up, and that exhale volume went up. So my mean went up to 28 from 23, my exhale volume went up to 450. So that could actually help both my PaO2 and my PaCO2. And that's the reason why the P high is a very special button. All these other settings that we're going to talk about, they're kind of seesaw settings. One will help one blood gas value, but it'll hurt the other. The P high setting is the only setting on the ventilator that you can actually positively influence both your PaO2 and your PaCO2 with the same change. So if I increase that P high, that's going to increase my mean. It's also going to increase my exhale tidal volume. That can help my PaO2 and my PaCO2. Is everybody good with that? Now, let's think about this. I said that we're using this for refractory hypoxemic patients, you know, and then I said we're setting a peak at 0, and then a lot of people kind of thought, you know, that kind of sounds weird. Now, just a quick question here. Not looking at this peak value, don't worry about that for just a second, but do you think that we have any peak for this patient?
Yes.
Yes. Now, how do you think that? Why do you
It
think
doesn't flatline or go all the way back
That's
to 0.
flow never gets back to 0. Very good. I can easily look at this waveform here and see that we're cutting off our expiratory flow before the next breath starts, before the patient actually ever exhales all the way. Now the question is, how much flow or how much auto peak are we having here? Easy way to check that, just do an expiratory hold till you guys see this say expiratory hold active. I see it now, I can let go. And I'm just going to go here, and I see that I have a total peak of 13. So even though I have a peak set of 0 or a P low of 0, I actually have a total peak of 13 because of the gas that I'm trapping here, because of where I have my T low set. Okay? Now, question about this. So we saw that the peak's 13, right? If I add 5 of peak, how much peak do I have now?
Probably 15.
Now, Gerald, that's an interesting number to come up with. I like the way you're thinking. Did you just come up out of random with that, or?
It's just an average. If you wanted 5 more, you would have to adjust it to get a total of 5, but you only get like a percentage of the number that you dial in.
And Gerald's dead on it. I mean, if I check this again, and I don't know if it's going to be 15 or not, it's going to be pretty close to that, I can tell you that. So Gerald's, I don't know if Gerald came in here and did the in-service before this, but he's dead on it. We got 15 of peak. And what he said is exactly right. When you add 5 of peak, you never get what you added. Okay? We added 5, but we only got 2. You know, so, but what else did we do? Remember we were dropping down and we had an exhale volume of 400? Well, now it's only 350. Why did that happen? Because instead of going from 25 to 0, we're now only going from 25 to 5. So my delta P is now at 20 instead of 25. So I'm cutting down my release volume, but I'm actually not getting the benefit of what I want, because just as Gerald said, I'm paying for 100% of that peak, but I only got, really in this particular instance, I only got 20% of the peak. So that's a bad ventilator trade-off, because the intrinsic peak that you already have created actually competes with this set peak, so you never get the actual value that you set. You know, you may get 1, you may get 2, you may get 3, but you're never going to end up getting 100% of the peak. Okay? So that's the reason why, you know, from a true mechanical standpoint from the ventilator, probably best to leave that at 0. If you want to adjust the peak, there's some other ways to do it, but this is not a very efficient way of adjusting the peak value. Okay? So now, T high and TP. Now, I've already kind of mentioned a little bit about the T high and what that will do. If I decrease the T high, what's that going to do to my number of releases?
It would increase the number of releases.
It will increase the number of releases, because what that essentially does is it decreases my total cycle time. So that's going to increase my number of releases. So what would that do to my minute ventilation?
your minute ventilation should go up.
It will go up. That's exactly right. That's for sure what's going to happen. It's going to go up because if right now I'm releasing 10 times a minute. If I go down here, I'm going to be releasing 15. My volume is going to stay the same. So 15 times around 400, that's going to be an extra, 5 times 400, that's going to be an extra 2 liters. So I'm going to end up with, 6 liters a minute ventilation now if I set this at 15 releases. Now, do I have to worry about anything with that? Will anything negatively change if I drop the T high from 5.5 down to 3.5?
It should affect the PCO2.
It's going to affect the PCO2 in a good way. I'm going to be able to lower my PCO2. But will it affect any? Let's do this. I want you guys to look at these values here. I'm going to hit accept. So I want you guys to just see if any of these values change. And I know that my rate's going to change, and I know that my minute ventilation is going to change. Did anything else change? Something just changed. My mean changed. It was 23, and now it's 22. Now, why did that happen? Because I'm holding the pressure in for a shorter period of time. And mean airway pressure, by definition, is pressure over time. So I drop my mean airway pressure some. So when I make a change with my T high, I got more releases out of it, so I've got a higher minute ventilation now. I went from 4 up to 5.5, but what ended up happening is I dropped my mean. But let's think about this from just a pure respiratory mechanical ventilation standpoint. I got an additional 2 liters a minute ventilation out of this, and I only had to pay for that with 1 centimeter of mean airway pressure. That would actually be a really good trade-off. That's a much better deal than my PEEP or my P low, because I only dropped my mean 1, and I ended up getting 5 extra releases over the course of a minute. So if I was having problems, if I put my patient on the ventilator, and I drew a blood gas, and I had a great PaO2, which you often will do after you put a patient in bivent, if I had a great PaO2, but then I had a really high PaCO2, which sometimes you'll have that in bivent as well, one of the first things that I'm going to think about is, because I have a good PaO2 and a bad PaCO2, I'm not going to change my P high anymore right now, because I'm only really going to change that when I'm having problems with both my PaO2 and my PaCO2. But with this patient, I'm only having problems with my PaCO2. So if I have a great PaO2, I can afford to lose 1 centimeter of mean airway pressure to pick up that extra 2 liters a minute in minute ventilation with the number of releases. So my T high is going to be my frontline choice for helping to, decrease my PaCO2. I'm going to decrease that value to help decrease that PaCO2 by increasing the number of releases. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to just go back here to 5.5 for just a second here. Now, what would happen? We have the T low or TP. What would happen if I decreased the amount of time for exhalation to occur? Because essentially this T-PEEP is my mechanical release for exhalation to occur, right? So what would happen if I decreased that time? If I took, and don't even think about bivent for a second, any patient on a ventilator, if you decrease the amount of exhalation time to occur, and if they're already having auto PEEP, would their auto PEEP go up or it would go down? It would probably go up, right? Because I'm decreasing, I'm shortening their exhalation time already. They actually need more time to exhale if I was really trying to get rid of the auto PEEP. So if I decrease this time, auto PEEP is going to go up. So if I check my auto PEEP again here, now I have a total PEEP of 17, by going to 0.3. What else, if I decrease that T low, what else is going to happen? Now, if I decrease this, I have a shorter time for exhalation to occur. What other value is going to drop? My dump tidal volume. That's exactly right. So instead of now having 400 cc's dropping, I'm only getting 250 when I drop. So
Does it change your mean also?
It did change the mean in this particular instance. It went from 23 to 24. So it certainly can, in some instances change the mean. So this helped my PaO2 a lot, probably. I went from 14 a peak to 17 a peak I also went from 23 to 24 on the mean, but I'm probably not going to ventilate the patient properly with a minute ventilation right now of 2.6, unless if I have the patient really picking up his spontaneous efforts. So that might be too big of a cut, in this particular patient. One of the easiest ways, depending on the literature that you read, and that sort of thing, one of the easiest ways that you can kind of calculate if you have your T-low set properly, you can do a save here. And when we save, we actually are just saving the waveform here, so it takes about 10 seconds for it to record. It records 10 seconds before you hit the save button and 10 seconds after you hit the save button. But once that recording message goes away, you can just simply hit Menu, Review the recorded waveform. And so this is the waveform that we just saved here. And if I look at this patient's peak expiratory flow, and all I'm going to do is just move the cursor down to where I find the patient's peak expiratory flow, and I found it to be 52 liters a minute here, and I can just look out there and see 52. And I'm just going to find out where I terminate expiration. And the place that I terminate expiration is the first positive number on this route. So I go there. I'm going to go right back to that last negative number. That's 39. So if I take 39 and divide that by 52, that's going to be right at about 75%. That means that I'm terminating exhalation at about 75% of what the peak expiratory flow was. I'm just taking the 39 here, the 52 here, and I'm dividing that by the 39, which is here. So 39 divided by 52, let me do it exact here. .75. So I'm terminating flow at 75% of the peak expiratory flow. And the literature that you'll read will pretty much say you want to trap gas somewhere around 50 to 75%. So you want to be in that value. Now, if that value was 0.9, for example, that would mean that I would be terminating flow too early. I would need to increase my time at low so that I would actually have more time for exhalation to occur. If that value was a value too low, I would need to decrease that time at low so I would trap more gas. So just kind of think about that when you make changes with that. But 50 to 75% of your peak is a good area to be air trapping. Okay? Now, so another thing I always kind of tell folks when they change this value, if they do change it, only change it 0.1 at a time is probably a great idea. Always check your expiratory, always check your total peak before and after you make a change, because you may have somebody who's come along and says, well, I'm gonna go from 0.5 to 1, and that may not seem like a big deal. Hey, I only went from it's only 0.5 seconds. That may not seem like a big deal, but if you get that long for exhalation to occur, you went from a peak of 13 down to a peak of 4. And you have no set mechanical peak here. So you have your ARDS patient now on a peak of 4. You're probably going to have a lot of de-recruitment go on whenever you make that big of a change. So like I said, for me on the TP,